All right, thank you so much for coming today. My name is Amber Schultz. I'm the Wildlife Education Program Manager again with Fish and Wildlife Education Division. And today we're going to be talking about learning through inquiry, the power of asking better questions. So I just wanted to go over a brief overview of what I'm going to try to cover today. Um, I know in past Lunch and Learns, we've talked about how learning happens. So we're going to touch on that just really briefly in the beginning, just to kind of re-look at that and how that's going to play into our questions. So how learning happens. We're also going to be talking about inquiry-based learning. We're not going to be diving into the entire framework of inquiry-based learning because it's a really incredible framework, but we're going to be speaking to it. And then really this whole webinar is really about practicing a skill that is integral to inquiry-based learning, which is asking questions. So we're going to be talking about asking better questions and how we can be improving our own questioning skills. Okay, so before we get started, so I want to know, how would you define learning? And if you can just think about it for a little bit and then maybe put it in the chat. Sean mentioned processing new information for long-term storage. That's great. That's a good one. I'll wait a few more seconds if anyone else. And use, yes, very good. So to apply that storage. That's great, Sean. Thanks so much. So we've talked about this in the past, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of, oh, okay, we have some really great comments now. So Courtney mentioned the act of gaining knowledge. Laura mentioned a process to understand. This is really good. Lori said reading, hearing, doing different things, having to write it and to remember it. It's very good. And Joel mentioned hands-on experiences, demonstrations, application of knowledge and information, acquisition of information. This is good. Dad mentioned expanding someone's previous knowledge. This is really, really good. You guys are all right around, what it truly means to learn. So I'm seeing words like process. It's really a process. Gaining knowledge. I'm seeing some stuff with memory here, and then I'm even seeing applying those skills. This is fantastic. So like I said, we have done a how people learn in the past on one of the Lunch and Learn series, so I won't go into it too much. And depending on where you are in your career, maybe many of you have this kind of knowledge on this. But just to kind of start at a baseline, there's kind of two overarching views on learning. One was more of a previous view, and then one is more of an evolved view of where we are now. So in the past, learning was thought to be more of this blank slate, which means if you're taking students, for example, and you're thinking about a formal education standpoint, students come to class with a blank slate of their mind on, say, the subject, say it's biology. And it was the teacher's job or the educator's job to completely fill their mind with brand new information. So the teacher is the transmitter of this knowledge from instructor to student. And that was really a lot of the views historically on learning. But with the advent of a lot of our educational psychology and neuroscience and all the different sciences that go into studying how people learn, we've come a long way with that. And now we're more with the understanding of the clever minds theory, which is learning is a process. It's a process of learners actually adding to and connecting and changing their ideas and explanations. And so kind of like a lot of you mentioned, more of this definition, but Thad, what you said, expanding someone's previous knowledge, that's a really important component to consider when you think about learning, because what this means is that every learner, student, audience member in your group comes to your program or presentation with some kind of previous understanding of what you're talking about. It could be very limited, but they do come with a previous understanding, and it's really important to understand that. And then the teacher is more of a guide. So the teacher is a guide to getting those learners to then build and improve on those understandings. So how do we engage this kind of learning? How do we engage that process? Well, there's one of the ways to do it is following a learning cycle. And this can happen naturally. This might even happen if you think about it in like organic conversations you have with family or friends, but it also can happen in classrooms. It can happen in programs, in any way that you want to be intentional about teaching a group. And so what the learning cycle is it starts with an invitation. It starts with an invitation to be curious about something. And so, for example, in this photo, I used to run bird banding field trips out in Western Nebraska. And so you can kind of all see in this photo, there's a bird here from the bird banding field station. And right there, the bird itself is an invitation to start that learning cycle because the students' interest is piqued, they're excited, they're curious, and so they're ready to learn. And then the second stage of the learning cycle is the exploration stage. And so instead of me standing there and telling them all there is to know about this beautiful spotted towhee here, what the exploration stage is asking them, engaging that previous understanding, engaging with what they notice, what do they observe, what does this remind them of, and just kind of starting to cultivate what that previous understanding is in their mind, and kind of using that to help guide how you're going to introduce the concept that you're about to talk about. And so after you've explored a bit with your group or with the students, this is when you actually introduce the concepts. So this could be, for example, in this example, I might be talking about migration, but I might not even mention the word migration for the first 15 or so minutes as we move through this learning cycle. So once everyone's interested and excited, once they've explored, and asked their own questions, then we're going to start taking their understanding and using this in talking about migration itself and what that means to this bird. So once you actually do the concept invention, after that, then you move to application. And so you've given them some actual knowledge to start to think about and apply to their understanding right here. And now we need to give them time and opportunity to then apply this knowledge. In this example here, often what we did is one of the stations after they got to see the bird and learn about migration is they went and played a migration game. And so I know that sounds like fun and silly, but what they were doing is they were applying that new knowledge in a way that made sense to them. We were playing a migration game. They're actually enacting and thinking about what a bird has to move through and think about during the challenge of migration. So that was the application. And then the last part of the learning cycle is reflection. And so, once we were curious about things, they got to explore it on their own, they learned new concepts, they applied them in unique ways. Then it's time to kind of stop and reflect on what they've learned today. Has their ideas changed? And really start to gauge, their understanding, their new understanding after this program or lesson or whatever it might be. And so there's so many amazing resources if you want to learn more about the learning cycle itself. That's not what I'm going to be focusing on today, but I did want to introduce that because the important thing to understand is that in every one of these components of the learning cycle, your ability as an educator to ask questions and to really listen and to encourage questions of the students is really, really important in each of these stages. Okay, so we learned a little bit about, really touched on a little bit about how people learn, the learning cycle. Now what I want to spend some time on is actually the inquiry-based learning itself. And so I want to hear from you all. Has anyone heard of inquiry-based learning? You can maybe put your hands up if you have. Some of us in the informal education field have. I know it's also done a lot in formal education as well. Oh, cool, this is helpful. Okay, so I see about half of the folks here have heard of inquiry-based learning. All right, so let's see, and Judy said yes. Okay, great. So thinking about what we know of how people learn, I want to ask you, which scenario do you feel or do you believe would allow for greater learning to take place, greater connections to be made? So I'm going to present you with two scenarios, and then just let me know which one you think would be most helpful in that. So the first scenario, you have a group of, let's say, fourth graders taking a hike through a prairie, and that day you're talking about pollinators, and so that's your concept. That's what you want to be speaking to. And so you come across this butterfly, and you gather them around, and you say, check out this pollinator. You can tell it is a pollinator. It has a long proboscis or a tongue. It's using it to drink the nectar from the flower. You can also see it has pollen on it if you look closely. Butterflies are very important pollinators. So that's your first scenario. And your second scenario, you gather the students around and you ask them, can you find the creature on the flower? How many legs does it have? Do you think this is an insect? What do you notice about this insect? What do you see it doing? Why do you think it's doing that? What does this remind you of? Do you think this could be a pollinator? How do pollinators help flowers? And then how might pollinators help humans? Obviously, I read that pretty fast, but you can imagine, also the responses from the students as well as you ask these questions. So what do we feel is the best scenario? Scenario 1 or scenario 2 for the greatest learning experience? I'm seeing a lot of 2s. That's great. Very good. And absolutely, I agree. This one has a lot, in this first scenario, you're starting off, you're drawing their attention to it, but then you're going right into teaching them about what you're seeing. And in the second scenario, you are drawing their attention to it, but then you're just really starting to get them to think about it on their own and their own understanding and engaging them in that learning process, which is a really important part of inquiry-based learning. So inquiry-based learning is a framework of like a teaching style, and it's really learner-centered. It's a collaborative process. It's an education strategy that really prioritizes the learner's questions and their ideas and their analysis. From the learner's point of view, it focuses on investigating an open question or solving a problem, but really they are tasked to use evidence and to critically think to solve a problem, and then often to present a conclusion. From the educator's point of view, as an educator, it facilitates critical thinking and understanding in learners, and by engaging their curiosity and guiding and supporting their investigation process. So you're really guiding them to their own understanding, which truly is, the definition of learning, or how learning takes place in the best way. So like I said, this is an incredible framework, and there's a lot of amazing resources on inquiry-based learning. Um, so if you'd like more resources on this in particular, I'd be happy to send some out. I have a few of my favorite resources that I'll send in this follow-up email. But I just wanted to draw your attention to it. We won't go into all the different ways you can do it. That should be its own webinar. But what I want to do today is really focus on the questioning part. Why are questions important in inquiry and teaching with inquiry? And how can we practice our skills as educators with asking better questions? So inquiry benefits the learner. Again, it utilizes their curiosity, which is a critical piece to learning and retention. There's actually been studies done that have said that when curiosity is piqued in students, there's actually a lot more activity in a certain region of your brain that is involved with memory. And so if their curiosity is piqued, if they're excited, if they're engaged in their own learning, they are more likely to even remember and have a greater retention of what they've learned. It empowers students to take ownership of their learning, and then that promotes growth mindset. So what's our goal when we're teaching, say a group of students something? Is our goal just so they know facts later that they might forget, or is our goal just to really empower them to keep learning on their own about a concept or a topic? So it does a great job of that. It's incredible at building skills. So you might be talking about pollinators, for example, but if you're using inquiry learning, you're building skills that will transfer to any other topic, subject, or a lot of different areas in their own life. For example, you're encouraging them to make observations, ask questions, critically think, and even analyzing and evaluating information. Think about how often we as professionals in this field right now have to use those skills on a daily basis, in our job. So really, it's a really important thing to teach those skills. It also promotes a deeper understanding of content. So instead of, for example, like I said, the group of students standing there for a lecture on pollinators, they're going to start to be able to understand, how was even the concept or idea developed? They might know why, for example, why or how pollination really works from their own understanding, or how they might apply the idea of what you're teaching into different subjects. That's a little bit about inquiry learning. So now we're going to get into really the question side of things. So we're going to get into the skill of asking effective questions. So good questions can do so many things when your goal is education, when your goal is trying to improve learning and create an understanding in students or a group. Of course, like we mentioned, that it engages a learner's curiosity, which is absolute fuel. Curiosity is just fuel for real, true learning. Reflect back on your own life. How many times, or think about a class or a subject that you got way more out of because you were actually excited about it and you were interested in it. So utilizing that curiosity is essential, and questions can do that. It encourages critical thinking. Questions can be used to assess understanding. So if you're not sure where your group falls, where their knowledge falls on a subject, you can kind of start to ask questions and get a baseline of where you might need to spend more time on a concept. It can help guide discussion and shape a positive learning environment. It really encourages collaborative learning. So that's not just as the educator, you're the sole transmitter of the knowledge to the students, but peer-to-peer learning and what can we learn from each other. Um, it helps build connections, which is really important, and that way you can relate to your learners. Also, what I really appreciate about good questions and being strategic about them is it allows for multiple perspectives and encourages a reflection of different ideas. We all know that we do not live in a world of black and white. We live in a world of gray and of nuance and of complexity. And so when we are strategic about our questions in an education format, we're making sure we're modeling that really, and we're allowing for multiple perspectives to be heard. And overall, it improves the understanding of core concepts and increases learning overall. So questions can be really critical to education. So there are two main types of questions. I'm sure many of us have heard of the open and the closed questions before. They're also known as broad and narrow. And the reason that I like broad and narrow is because it's more to do with the answers, right? So broad questions, what that means is there's not one specific answer. There's a broad spectrum of answers and perspectives that can be shared when you ask a broad question. When you ask broad questions, it requires higher level thinking. It's not a rote memorization and then spitting out a fact. They really have to think about it. They have to think about, again, their own mental model, their understanding of what they have. It allows them to explore kind of new ideas, makes observations, and even do the personal reflection. All of these are critical to learning. And then broad questions really promote discussion. And what I mentioned before, they promote divergent thinking. And what that means is that you may have multiple perspectives on something really similar. And by asking broad questions, everyone in your group feels safe to share that their answer, they have something valid to share because it's not a fear of, did I get it right or wrong? So broad questions are really, really important when we're being strategic about our questions in education. Narrow questions are also important too. They serve different needs. So a narrow question has a specific answer. It can help you, answer requires recall of information or facts. So sometimes you can use it to assess, or just to get your group's attention and kind of call back attention. You can kind of ask them something that they maybe have just learned. And it promotes group response and convergent thinking. And the important thing here is there's not one type of question that's wrong or better than the other. Something to note is that more often than not, without thinking about it, most educators are asking way more narrow questions than we realize. And so that's something to kind of think about, because maybe it's a little easier to ask those narrow questions, but it's all about what you're trying to achieve. And so it's thinking about what you want your outcomes to be. What are your goals? And so for your goal, if your goals are for students to learn and figure things out through exploration and discussion, a broad question would be great in that setting. If your goal is to include diverse students' backgrounds of viewpoints and perspectives, make sure you're having a good set of broad questions in your education program. If your goal in the moment is to recall information, a narrow question is appropriate and it fits in that setting. Or review a topic that's already learned, or even assess those gaps in knowledge. Narrow questions are great for that as well. So for the next one, I want to we learned a little bit about what broad questions are, what narrow questions are. Again, maybe this is just review for some folks, but it's really nice and to think about this and be intentional about it. So how can we apply that? Can you look through those previous questions that we asked in that second scenario? And can you identify the narrow questions you see here? So think about it a little bit. You could maybe put the number that you think are narrow questions in the chat. I'll give you about 30 or so seconds. Okay, I'm seeing 3, 7, 2, 1, 8. Remember, narrow question has one solid good answer. Or it's a yes or no, or it's a number, or something like that. It's good. Okay, and so what about the broad questions? Can you identify the broad questions in this list? I have multiple answers. It allows people to think about their perspective. Good, 6, 9, 10. Okay, thanks for doing that. So this is what I can kind of see as the narrow questions here. So can you find the creature on the flower? It's a really great way to use a narrow question to just get a response, get that group response. You want to gather everyone's attention and kind of point and get them ready for learning. How many legs does it have? That's one answer. Is this an insect? That's definitely a yes or no. So that's really good. And in that sense, the goal of that would probably be, gauging their understanding. Are we all starting off with the same knowledge of what an insect is, before we talk about pollinators? Is this a pollinator? Yes or no? How do pollinators help flowers? This one I can see as maybe it could be broad, but there's a general right answer here. But you'd certainly be open to hearing more perspectives. And then broad questions. This is what I had for the broad ones. So what do you notice? That's a fantastic, really great example of a broad question, just asking them what do they notice. That's a very subjective experience for them. What do you see it doing? You might get a lot of different answers there, and you might hear from someone who sees something that you don't there. So that's kind of cool. Why do you think it's doing that? Often the why questions are obvious broad questions. What does this remind you of? This is a really important one. I think this is like in my back pocket, but what do you notice and what does it remind you of is just a back pocket classic question, especially like if you're on a hike or if you're on an outing or anything with a group. It's a really good one. And then how might they help humans? There are some definitely right answers here, but there's also some open for interpretation and to hear from your audience of what they think. So just to kind of continue, I wanted to share some really good broad question examples. And these are questions that are helpful when you're kind of thinking about planning for a program or a lesson to really make sure we're strategic and including, a lot of broad questions in our teaching. And so a lot of these will elicit great reflection, great response, and great discussion from students. So why do you think something is doing that? So say you're, whether you're looking at these really cool little hairy caterpillars here I have or anything else. Why do you think it's doing that? What are some similarities between something and something? That's a really great one to start to almost apply different content. What does this remind you of? What do you notice? How might you explain? That's a really good one. What do you think about it? Or do you agree with? You might present a scientific idea or a new idea or a thought on something, and then you ask them to discuss and ask if they agree. What surprised you about something? How might something's adaptations help them survive? Can you show me your evidence for how you came to that conclusion? That's a really good one, and that helps that helps them practice that critical thinking and evidence-based thinking. what kind of effects, what kind of things affect something. So cause and effect is really good. What might happen to something if the environment changes? And what do you think caused something? These are some of my favorite questions to use. Before I move on, does anyone have a favorite question that they like to use that you might include in this list of just a good question toolkit? If you think of one, put it in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is kind of apply some of these concepts and just be able to practice a little bit coming up with some different questions. So I'm going to put a Jamboard link in the chat, and I want to give you just a few minutes, and there are 3 different slides on the Jamboard, and they're asking you to think about a few things. Number 1, there are 3 different audiences. So feel free to gravitate to the audience maybe you're most comfortable with. K through 2nd, 4 through 6, or 9th through 10th. So again, why is that important? Because we're thinking about their knowledge or what they might already know, and we're trying to be mindful of that in how we ask those questions. And so you're going to see a picture on this Jamboard, and you're going to start to put in example questions of what you might put to engage with your group. Let me share the link. 1 second, please. Okay, so everyone should have a link to what this is. And if you have not used Jamboard before, what you want to do is just over here on the left, you can click sticky note and you just type in your question here. And once you click something, you press save and you can move it around on the screen. Again, there's 3 different prompts here. It's really similar. Your goal is you want to help the students understand how energy flows through ecosystems, through food webs. And so you come across 3 different scenarios. There's a squirrel eating a nut. There's what seems to be maybe an owl pellet with maybe even a squirrel skull in it or some kind of rodent skull. And then the last one, there is a chicken of the woods. There's a really cool mushroom on a log. And so at the bottom of it, you'll see the different audience. So the last one is 9th through 10th. The middle one is 4 through 6, and the first scenario is K through 2nd. Feel free to just take a minute or 2. You don't have to add to every one. Just choose which one you'd like to add to and come up with some cool questions that you might be able to utilize, whether they're broad or narrow, to increase the learning in this scenario to reach your goal. Let everybody finish up some of your questions. I'm seeing some great ones. I'm looking at the first one when we have our K through 2nd graders, so our littler kids. And I really like this note right here. It says, does anyone see an animal in the tree? So just drawing their attention to it. What do you notice about the creature? What is it doing? What's it look like it's eating? Where do you think it came from? These are just fantastic. These are really great. I can see myself like asking these same questions in that sequence even on this little nature hike. So that's great. Another question, if he eats all his food in December, what will he do for food the rest of the winter? That is a really good question. Very good. Really get some thinking about the long term, what he's going to do. What type of food does our squirrel have and how will it help him? Really good. I'll look at the second page now. When there's an owl pellet and you have a little older students, 4th and 6th, what does this tell you about what this creature had for lunch? Yep. Way more effective than you holding it up and saying, this is an owl pellet and this is what it ate. You're engaging them, you're getting them to think about what it could be. How did this get here? Can you tell me what this is? Does this object remind you anyone of anything? That's a really good one. What do you notice? What are some of the items that the owl ate? What do you think the creature ate that the owl ate? Okay, so you're kind of like doing the whole food web of it. That's fantastic. And then I'll look at the last one. Touch it. What does it feel like? What else do you notice? I really like that one. What does it feel like? That's great. Do you think these organisms represent the producer, consumer, or decomposer stage of the energy flow? And why? So I think this is an excellent question, and it's a loaded one, and it has a lot of scientific words, but you're being mindful that in 9th and 10th grade, more than likely they'll understand those words. So that's really good. And it's kind of speaking to their level. Are these something that looks like a creature could eat them? If yes, why do you think that? Why are these on the log? Awesome. That's excellent. Thank you so much for doing that activity. And I hope it was just kind of helpful to be, practicing and thinking about how we can use questions um, to increase learning. So let me go back to my screen really quick. We learned a bit about some really good ways to ask questions and why. Now, how can we improve our own questioning skills? This is the last thing we'll speak about today. So, and again, if you have any thoughts on, strategies that you've used or questions that you've asked or ways that you've improved your skills, I'd love to hear. So feel free to put those in the chat. But to get us started, first I want you to think back on a time where you remember learning about something and you were really excited, and think about the educator who is delivering that, the educator who is facilitating that. I know I have several in my mind. I'm not sure how everyone feels if you have a standalone teacher or professor or someone. But think about that. What qualities did that person have who got you excited about learning a specific thing? And if you can think of something, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, Sean said genuine enthusiasm. Very good. Judy says made it relevant to me. Dakota said curiosity. That's awesome. Passion and excitement. Hands-on activities. Respect for system understanding, not just the correct answer. That's awesome, Jamie. I love it. That's great. So a lot of these things, these are great, and these are things to me. What I'm hearing is those instructors and those educators were modeling what learning really is all about. And as humans, we are much better. We're much more inclined to learn from others by what they do rather than just what they say. So if your educator, or if your instructor, your teacher is modeling curiosity, is modeling enthusiasm and excitement, it's easier for us to pick that up and carry that into our own learning. So great. One of the things I want to touch on is our roles as educators, especially with kind of thinking about how people used to think about learning as, one educator is just responsible for transmitting just the knowledge, and that's it. It's really something to think about, is what is the role, what is learning itself, but what is the role then of an educator who's helping facilitate that learning. And there's a resource called Beatles Education, and it's about the best practices of ecological and environmental education. And they do a really cool training on what our role is. And I use some of their resources here, and I think they do a really great job. But one of the roles you might find if you are if you run into an educator, say you're doing a naturalist program or interpretation program, one of the roles you might see is a sage on stage. And so what this role is this person is really the instructor, gives the information and the student receives it. The instructor is the authority of and the keeper of the information. And education is the transmission of information from one source to another. What does this remind you of as far as learning goes? Because to me, it reminds me almost of that blank slate thinking of learning, right? Where it's just about you as an educator, your role is just to give the information. And so this is just something, lectures. Yeah, very good. Traditional education, yep. This is something to be mindful of, like a role that you could slip into. So sage on the stage is one role. Another role is the entertainer. So learning should be fun and exciting. The focus really is on the instructor's engaging performance and delivery of the information, and students may be actively entertained. They might not be the most intellectually engaged, but they're like excited and they're having fun. This is also another, it's a valid role. It's one I've seen a lot, and also it's one I've even played a lot, especially early on in my career as an environmental educator. You want to get kids outside and you want to have fun, and so this has its importance too. Is similar to questions. It's not saying one is worse than the other. It's just being mindful of our intention as educators. The last role, and this truly is the role that we want to strive for, especially based on understanding how people learn and understanding how to engage people in the learning process. This is more of the guide on the side. So learning is through shared inquiry, it's collaborating and investigations. The focus is on the thinking and cognition of the student. Students get to express their ideas, they expose conflicts, they're guided to either reinforce or build upon or replace their ideas. And so this, to me, this is where we really want to strive to be as educators. You know, there are times when stage on the stage is appropriate, um, for sure. And there are times when, you know, you do want to make learning fun and you do want to be entertaining. And so you'll move probably between all of these in your career, but just to be mindful and be intentional of what you want to strive for is you are guiding their learning. So make sure the focus is about, you know, their thinking and their cognition. Any questions on that? Has anyone seen this before or been thinking about this kind of thing before? All right. The last thing is just some kind of basic tips to improve your own questioning skills. I think something that gets taken for granted is people are just naturally good at asking questions. They're naturally good at engaging. They're naturally good at that kind of education. But the truth is, questioning is a skill that can be practiced. And so it's just about thinking about being mindful of that and how you can practice your own skills. The first thing that is really helpful to do is take a personal question inventory. So think about when you're teaching or when you're presenting or whatever role you play, and kind of almost let yourself, without judging yourself, think about the questions that you ask, and then think later, maybe you're writing them down and think, oh my gosh, I am mostly asking only narrow questions. Um, I'm only asking narrow questions. I'm really not asking those questions that gets, you know, the response and gets them thinking about their own perspective. So do a personal question inventory. That's really helpful. Build a personal question toolkit, especially if you are always teaching about a certain subject. You know, I'm in the ecological education field, so ecology, it's a pretty broad topic, so I have lots of things to teach about, but I do have some go-to questions that are really helpful. Be strategic about your questions. When you're planning, sorry, someone asked if we can send the question skills to as a PDF. Yes, absolutely. I'll send the whole presentation as a PDF afterwards to participants. Thanks for asking. Um, but when you're planning your lesson plan or your curriculum, you know, don't think about questions as an afterthought. Include them in how you're going to be teaching, and be mindful of them, and be strategic about, you know, what are your outcomes you're trying to achieve here? What kind of questions can I ask to achieve those outcomes? You're really mindful of the time for thinking and responding. And so it's one thing to ask, you know, a question of the group, but make sure it's hard to do and it takes practice, but make sure then you have patience and you wait. Be comfortable with silence. Silence is okay. That means brains are thinking. Um, so give them some time to really think and respond in a more meaningful way. Create alternatives to "Are there any questions?" This is a go-to. I still use it all the time. But what's the point of this question? Are there any questions? You want to ask the group, what more, what more can I clarify? What did I get everything across that I wanted to? So maybe you can start to be thinking about different ways to ask that. You could say, I covered a lot today. Did I leave anything out? You know, that's just one example. Um, Work towards being comfortable with asking questions you do not know the answer to. This is a big one, and this takes practice. But I know that I have found the more questions I ask that I don't know the answer to. Number one, you're modeling to your group of students that you don't have to know everything. That's not the point. The point is thinking and asking those questions. And number two, you will find I have found that I actually learn more when I ask questions I don't know the answer to, because then we get discussion going and we get some really cool conversations happening. Improve your listening ability. So it probably goes without saying, if you're asking questions, the other part of that is listening. So this is also obviously a skill that can be practiced. And that's probably a whole nother webinar on being a better listener in the education setting. But that's something to think about as well. And then one of my favorite tips is just learn from other educators and be open to feedback. I think the most I've ever learned in my 10 years of being an environmental educator is I learned a lot of great content in college, but I learned the most by watching amazing educators and watching other ones with more experience and learning from them and asking them, how can I improve? That's a really good one. So putting it all together, there's a lot to think about here. My main takeaway, though, is that questions are really important and they can be practiced and they can really engage learners and create a better experience and reach your outcomes of what you're trying to teach. This is one of my favorite quotes. I think it really kind of wraps what we talked about up. Do not try to satisfy your vanity by teaching a great many things. Awaken people's curiosity. It's enough to open minds. Do not overload them. Put there just a spark. If there's some good inflammable stuff, it will catch fire. Well, that's all I have for you today. I would love to hear from you. For this last question I have your ideas changed about questions and their role in education? Or have your ideas changed about what our role is as educators? Or how might you use any of these ideas? If you feel like sharing in the chat, I would love to see it. Otherwise, just be thinking about it. Sean mentioned being comfortable with admitting I don't have all the answers was really hard for me to overcome. Thanks for sharing that, Sean. That's fantastic. It really is. But the outcome is greater because you're modeling it, because no one knows absolutely everything, and so you're making space that that's okay, and it's more important to be learning than it is to have the right answer. Lori said she'll be using some of this in the near future. Great, Lori, that's great. Awesome. If there's no more questions or thoughts, I just want to thank you all again for participating today. I'll be sending out an evaluation tomorrow, along with some really great resources that I've found in this topic, and hopefully it'll help. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.